I will kick off and people can join as I do so. So the first thing to say is just thank you all so much for joining today's webinar, where we'll be exploring the question of how trustees can be more adaptive and more systemic. This is part of a series of webinars that are supported by the Clothworkers Company. So I just want to say a huge thank you to them for supporting this series again this year. This is the second of four in that series. So we have two more coming up. If you're not signed up, they're set to be really fantastic events. So the third webinar is on trusteeship and influencing in the new political landscape. That's happening on Wednesday, the 4th of June from 1 till 2 p.m. And the final one in the series is about achieving impact in a challenging financial context. We'll be looking at some of the different models that organisations are using to continue to deliver impact as their financial situations change. That one's on the 8th of July, and it's again a slightly longer one like today from 12:30 till 2 p.m. Both of those are online on Zoom, very similar things, and we hope that the lunchtime slot makes it slightly easier to slot in around your busy working and trustee lives. My name is Naomi Chapman. I'm the Principal Consultant for Strategy at NPC, so I lead a lot of our work around helping organisations to develop and implement more adaptive strategies and to work in more systemic ways. So I'm really passionate about the topic today. I suppose the lens that I come to this work through is often working with chief executives and working with staff teams to think about the processes they need to do this work. So it's really exciting to think about how that can be kind of layered up to the governance level, and how we can think about these two ways of working that are really essential for achieving impact in the world that we live in. So in terms of today's session, I'm going to be giving a bit of background, some high-level thoughts from NPC about our thoughts on what adaptive and systemic approaches look like at a governance level. Then we have two really brilliant speakers who are going to add a bit of flavour to that, talk about their own experience and their own work in this area. We'll have quite a lot of time for Q&A, so if you have questions as we go, please do submit them into the Q&A box, and then there'll be, towards the end, a chance to reflect on your own practice and think about how you might take forward some of this work. Just caveating now, don't worry, we're not going to put people on the spot to talk. It will just be a kind of reflective and interactive session, and then you can take forward some of those actions. Before we start, I was hoping to just get a sense of who is in the room with us today. So Gillian, if you would be able to launch the poll, that will just pop up with two questions and really help us to understand the audience. I'll give everyone a moment to complete that. Great. Fantastic. I'll just give you all a minute to fill out those two questions about kind of who you are and the lens you're bringing to the work today, and how confident you are with some of the concepts we'll be talking about. And then I'll ask my fellow panelists to bear that in mind as we go through the conversation. Just give it 20 seconds more. Great. Gillian, if you could close the poll, then hopefully we can see the results. Fantastic. So most of you here today are trustees yourself who are trying to be more adaptive and systemic, but we do have some people here who are staff members trying to encourage that from the other side and playing other supporting roles. Interesting kind of picture of how confident people are. A few very confident people, that's great. I'd love to hear your reflections when we move into the interactive section towards the end, but the bulk of people being either kind of quite confident or in the middle or quite unconfident. So that's great. There's room for all of us to learn together today. Fantastic. So without further ado, I will move into my introductory presentation about how trustees can be more adaptive and systemic. So I suppose the first thing to do is just define what we mean by adaptive and systemic. So at NPC, when we talk about adaptive strategy, it's really about having a way of working and having a strategy that is able to change to suit changing conditions, having ways of regularly drawing on up-to-date insight to make decisions, and potentially setting a really high-level direction of travel for your organisation, and then thinking about how you can implement that quite iteratively, rather than a potentially previous strategy model where you'd set a really detailed plan for the next 5 years and then just deliver that. And this is all really a response to the fact that change is feeling more rapid, the external environment feels more unpredictable, and so for organisations to stay agile, to stay nimble as that changes. They need to become adaptive, become change ready, and acknowledge that they can't anticipate everything when developing a strategy or a plan. On the systemic side, this really responds to a recognition that individual organisations will never achieve their goals, and that there is a need to kind of work together to recognise that we exist as part of a wider system in order to achieve the impact that we are looking for. So here it's really about, as I say, looking and thinking beyond your organisation, thinking about ways that you can maybe move from organisational analysis to systems analysis. It's about thinking about how and when you work collectively, whether that's to set kind of collective strategy or bring in partnership in your delivery. And also it's about taking that, often when we hear about a systemic approach, it's about thinking about the kind of root causes or considering why problems are occurring and how to fix them, rather than thinking about the kind of specific symptoms of an issue. So both of these kind of key trends, and these are areas that we hear a lot of conversation about across the impact sector, both of these trends will have implications for how boards are set up, what board papers might cover, how meetings might be run, how decisions are translated into action, how you might track progress, and how you keep learning and improving on your practice. So today's conversation is a kind of starting point. It's some ideas for how you might do that, but it's not the kind of final, and this is how you do it, and this is the one-size-fits-all approach to these two principles. It's about kind of applying this to your own organisational context. So zooming in a little bit more on the adaptive side of things and what this means for trustees, often we see kind of three key changes as at a board level as organisations move towards a more adaptive strategy model. So the first is that insight gathering and decision making moves closer to the implementation level, where practitioners or those on the front line are really able to see change, see what's happening in the external environment, and respond to it quickly and make those decisions. And it might be that this involves kind of having processes for feeding up some of that insight to where decisions are made if it can't be made by those who are seeing it directly. It means a kind of shift in our board culture to allow more uncertainty and change, and kind of recognising that you won't have all of the granular detail all of the time from your executives or from your staff teams. There's a question in my mind as to how much this is actually a change in kind of governance. I feel like as boards, we've often talked about pivoting and kind of changing and responding, but this perhaps is just a change in emphasis from pivoting as things emerge to expecting change and expecting flexibility from the outset of your work. And finally, the role of the board, as it always is, and as you hear often in these webinars, is to continue focusing on strategic alignment and holding that kind of big picture thinking space that may be more difficult for those who are delivering work, who are making decisions, who are helping your work to adapt in response to changes. So here the role of the board is really in things like horizon scanning, having that foresight about what might be coming down the line, and also in staying really focused on what the objects of your organisation are, what the North Star that you are working towards might be, and ensuring that in becoming more adaptive, you don't become too adaptive, and holding that kind of key overall alignment. In terms of how this might be done in practice, these are just a few examples from the work that NPC does and from the network of organisations that we have conversations with. On the insight gathering and decision making moving closer to implementation level, we've seen this work really well, where organisations have set really clear shared expectations around how much flexibility there is, and on kind of updating their schemes of decision making or delegation, so that it's really clear kind of how much flex each person is able to authorise, what still needs to come to board level, and what can be at different levels. This is a change in a way of working often for staff teams, especially those who are closer to implementation level, who may be more used to decisions being made by the board or by the senior leadership team and then implementing that work. And so thinking about how your training and support for staff might need to change in order to kind of build confidence to make those decisions and to work in this slightly more adaptive way. In terms of changing your board culture to be more comfortable with uncertainty and change, this really comes down to kind of how we report and how we track the work of our organisation as a board. So you might want to consider new approaches for monitoring success. We've seen really interesting examples where this is instead measured against organisational values and the extent to which decisions are being made in line with values, or kind of updates to the way that we might use a red, amber, green type rating to focus on different parts of the work that we do. Being really open and kind of seeing your role as a board as leading that culture change and being speaking openly about the culture that you want to see. So kind of setting the example, talking openly about the fact that you are embracing uncertainty and change as a board, and then thinking about questioning every part of how you operate, and thinking, is this actually supporting us to be adaptive, to make decisions at pace if we need to, or are there ways that we could be doing that better? That might become part of the board audit process you go through, or annual conversations with the chair, kind of speaking openly, reflecting on the extent to which you are achieving this. And just ensuring, throughout that the way that you're making decisions, and as I mentioned, this could link to measurement, thinking about how the processes you're setting up reflect your organisational values and are supporting you to act in line with those principles. Finally, in terms of focusing on strategic alignment and big picture thinking, the role of the board here really becomes to provide that strategic clarity and being really clear about the outcomes or the impact you're looking to see as an organisation, without necessarily dictating the plans and the how of the work. And so that then becomes the work of your senior leadership and of your staff teams to think about how can we best achieve these clear outcomes goals. Some really specific examples that we've seen work in other organisations is where they've had some space in annual budgeting for new areas of work, and reflecting that even within the annual budgeting cycle, new things will emerge, change will be needed, and so having some of that ring fenced for that. And another being that kind of setting up a structure for ensuring some of that strategic alignment. So going back to my previous point about the role of the board being to kind of hold the parameters within which others can be adaptive, thinking about how that can be a really practical process. So other organisations have had a kind of help desk model where people want to kind of sense check a decision or sense check a new piece of work or the closure of a piece of work. And so they have a kind of panel of people that they can sense check that with, and then feel confident to move forward with that. On the systemic side of things, as I say, this is all about kind of thinking about your role in that wider system. So the first thing to do at a board level is think about how you can bring in external perspectives and kind of change the lens through which you're looking at the issue that you're looking to tackle. So that might be your peers, it might be your partners, it might be organisations you think of as competitors, those who might give a more challenging perspective. And it might be bringing them in actually formally into your governance, or finding ways that they can kind of feed into the thinking at governance level without taking on a formal role. In some places, as I mentioned previously, this might be about actually setting some of your strategy and your priorities with peers and partners. So there is some really lovely examples emerging in the sector of organisations who are coming together and defining a kind of systems level vision, a systems level North Star, and then understanding what the role of different organisations might be in pursuing that, rather than doing that work at a very organisational level, where often we get bogged down in conversations about how we sustain our organisation and the work that we do and our charity brand, as opposed to the kind of impact of the system as a whole. And then throughout, kind of holding that systems level view, and in the kind of conversations you have with your chief exec and with your leadership, kind of coming back to that broader question and thinking about some of the wider dynamics that affect the work that you're doing. In terms of how this can be kind of done practically, so I've mentioned this might be thinking about your board composition and who actually makes up the board that oversees the work of your organisation. It might be instead about kind of establishing those channels for peer conversations at board level. So having almost a buddy scheme with trustees at organisations that are similar to yours, or potentially working in a different way, but where you feel there's key learning. And it's also about creating ways for people with lived experience to contribute to governance and bring in that key perspective that's often missing. If you're interested specifically in the question of embedding people with lived experience in your board, that was the topic of a previous one of these webinars, and so we can make sure the link to that recording goes out in the follow-up email. In terms of setting strategy with your peers and with your partners, I talked a little bit about this already, but having that kind of process of articulating a shared vision, being really open about your priorities and focus areas, so that people can at least, even if you're not able to set priorities together, they can at least be really clear about what you are doing and what you are working on and respond accordingly. And then where possible, kind of delivering in partnership, in collaboration, finding ways of pooling resources and drawing on the capabilities of multiple organisations to tackle a social issue. In terms of holding a systems level view, I've again kind of alluded to some of this already, but it's around kind of moving from that organisational analysis to a systems analysis. So often as boards, we'll spend time doing things like a SWOT analysis where we're thinking about our organisational strengths, our organisational weaknesses, as opposed to doing that at a kind of systems level and where are the gaps in services, where are people falling through the cracks, where are there potentially kind of vicious cycles where people are getting stuck in a system and stuck in a cycle of negative outcomes. I've talked again about the kind of providing some of that accountability and thinking about ways that you can bring the big picture into those conversations for organizational leaders who might be very caught up in the day-to-day work of an organization, understandably using your role as a trustee to kind of zoom out and think about that big picture. And that applies too to the kind of underlying causes and dynamics, and feeling that you are confident as a board that you could articulate what the key causes of the issue you are tackling are, what the key, and therefore how that has informed the response that you as a charity deliver. That's a very high level kind of view of our perspective on what an adaptive approach for trustees might look like and what a systemic approach for trustees might look like. And before we go to our panel, I just wanted to kind of pause and say, I recognise that trustees and many of you on the call today already have a lot on their plates, and we're conscious of the need to avoid trustee overwhelm, trustee burnout, and approach all of this work in a really practical and proportionate way. So this doesn't need to be a complete reinvention of the wheel. It's about where you can make tweaks in your existing processes to bring in some of this thinking throughout. NCVO's trustee recruitment report that came out in the autumn said that 79% of charities found it difficult to fill board vacancies, and with time requirements being the kind of biggest factor in that, we need to think about how we can do this work, what it means in practical terms, and how we can balance this thinking and trustees being more adaptive and systemic with the other requirements that trustees face. So that's kind of a caution as we move into the next stage of our presentation, and I hand over to two of our fabulous speakers. So I'm just going to stop sharing my slides and introduce you to our first wonderful speaker. So today with us we have Tom Gash, Managing Director of Leapwise, which is a specialist decision-making consultancy. Tom has spent his career supporting decision-making of ministers and prime ministers, senior officials, and the boards of many non-profits and private companies across the world. So we're really excited to have Tom's perspective on today's conversation. So Tom, if I could ask you first, what are the fundamentals that drive board effectiveness, and how can more adaptive and systemic approaches help us as trustees to be more effective?
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to kind of cop out of part two of that question slightly. Let me just first share some slides on the screen. And I'm going to focus on part one, really, which is around the kind of fundamentals of board effectiveness. I think of the platform off which you build these kinds of approaches, and the maturity of the board and the readiness of the board to take on different approaches is going to vary. And sometimes you just need to get the basics right. So you'll all be in different positions. I think some of the things that were mentioned are, however, probably doable right from the word go for any board. So I'm going to run through how I've come to think about board effectiveness, particularly from my work with Leapwise, where we've probably done, I would say in the dozens of board effectiveness reviews, and we have a particular methodology for doing that. Mostly work in the public sector. So we have sort of different types of board to the charitable sector boards, with the trustee responsibilities that are different, but we do also work on those as well. Now, this is quite a lot on a slide, but what I did was, the way we think about board effectiveness is basically to say, these are the things that matter for the effectiveness of a board. Clarity of purpose in various different ways. Don't worry about the stuff on the right so much. We won't go into all of that dense text. The quality of the information coming in, the way in which you process that, those inputs, that dynamic, the dynamic that you can create, the human relationships that you can create in the board environment, and then your ability to transmit that into decisions and action and change within the organization that you're governing. And so that's how we sort of think about it. Is that kind of golden thread through to from clarity of purpose all the way through to actual change at the front line of organizations. So always thinking about how can you get to the reality that is fast changing and quite distant from the board in some way or other. So what I did is during that brilliant talk from Naomi, I was writing down the different parts of their recommendations and where they fit into the picture. And so I think basically they map incredibly neatly onto the framework. So in terms of thinking about purpose, there was a really interesting thing about actually thinking about the goals from a sort of system-wide perspective, and then the role of your organization within the system seems to be an incredibly important part of what any organization should be do when it's defining its board role and purpose, and I'm getting that really clear. We have other things that you need to do from a sort of, mapping up to matching with your statutory purpose and all those other things. But then I thought that a lot of what Naomi was saying was about the information that you're getting in, with a particular emphasis on broadening the basis for the information, which I think is really interesting and really common in boards. So the tendency is to be executively controlled as a trustee. Broadly, got a lot of full-time people who are trying to manage the organization. And from their perspective, they will give you the most important information that they can think of. But I think a lot of boards are thinking about how can they find ways to reach into different sources of insight on what's really happening out there and in the organization and for, service users, customers, whatever, depending on what the nature of your enterprise is. And so I thought there was a lot of stuff in what Naomi was saying, which sort of fits with what would be good governance anyway, of making sure that you have information that reflects reality and thinking about how you have different sources of information. Your executives will always want to control the flow of information to you, and that's in many ways sensible because they can curate and help sense make, and you want to have that kind of trusted kind of relationship. I think there is something about having alternative sources of reality testing and thinking about how you agree. What is the sensible way of having different sources of information coming in without it becoming kind of gotcha for the management of that structure? And so I thought those were really interesting things. One of the things that we've started to talk about with some boards that we've reviewed, I remember reviewing a charity board three or 4 years ago, where one of the key problems was actually that everything was very agendarized and the agenda and the nature of the conversation was controlled. And so I thought of something really interesting about having open spaces in agenda. And since then, it's been a kind of quite a recurring theme of kind of one of the ideas we tend to think about. One of the menus of interventions for a board when we're trying to improve its effectiveness can just be have an open space in the agenda where people get to sort of say, I've got this concern about this. There isn't really it doesn't really fit into any of our normal categories. I don't know if it's a thing or not, but I want to be talking about this. It's something that's come up. I want to have some space. So we're thinking about how you do that, even in the board meetings, not just at the away days, but in the regular flow of information so that you can create a more free and adaptive approach to the board structure. Um, then there's this really interesting thing that came up from you, Naomi, about humility and flexibility. So on inputs, by the way, I would just say that the most consistent finding before you get into all of the adaptive stuff, most management reports and use of data and information to track the impact of an organization with your theory of change behind it. I'm sure you've all done sessions on that. So you want these end results. What are the indicators of success, et cetera, et cetera? The data that you will get to track that as a trustee is normally not good enough. And without that, what I've seen happen consistently is rather than keeping the eye on the big picture and progress towards goals and a sense of what are the key things we need to track, it becomes for my public sector boards, I do a lot of work in policing and criminal justice, and it becomes what happened last week, what's blowing up at the moment, what do we need to talk about, and the agenda gets filled with that, or it becomes um, people putting things on the agenda because it's their pet topic or something that they're particularly interested about, and I think a bit of that is really good, but it's the balance without the strategic flow of information that says this is how we consistently in every single board meeting or in every other board meeting or whatever it is track the core performance of achievement of our purpose, then then you really are in trouble. So I think that basic fundamental is normally not in place, in my experience, with most of the boards that we work with, because it takes a bit of work to do it. The value of having it is enormous before you even start to add on these different sources of insight that we've been talking about today. So I think fundamentals first there before you start to think about, do we have frontline voice, and getting into that space, like, can we actually track whether we're making an impact that we want to make and that we're managing risk and all those different things. um in the process and dynamic space, I was really struck by um what this meant for the stance that people were going into the room with as trustees. So are they coming to give their expertise, or are they coming to learn, reflect, co-produce? And what does that mean? So how, and that's where we'd normally dig in quite a lot into a group setting, into questions like psychological safety and the ability of different voices to be heard and represented. Um, and then the other thing, so that's, I think, that kind of humility, flexibility to how people are showing up in the board meeting and how you create the conditions for that in a relational sense is really important. One of my basic bugbears of boards is that they're often too big. And so I am concerned about the ideas of much more representation on the boards leading to bigger boards. Bigger boards, in my experience, are much less functional and have much less satisfaction, much lower rates of satisfaction among trustees than smaller boards. There are ways of dividing up and giving role clarity, but I think if we're trying to bring in these voices, think very carefully about how you do that and whether that means needs to have a role on the board, or whether there are other mechanisms, or think about the substitution rather than the addition of skills into the mix. And then when it comes to results, we took sort of that message that you gave, Naomi, about, well, the job of the board is really to set the direction here and really keep communicating the outcomes and the goals that people are driving for and how they can adapt. And I think celebrating part of that should be about celebrating success and adaptation that you see as it's coming through, and praising that, and giving the right signals about what's valued to the organization coming through. So this was just literally hearing what you were saying, Naomi, and giving some reflections on that and some of the fundamentals behind it. What I was going to say is, like, one of the things that we are really into is being kind of getting data driven about how you understand whether the board is functioning well. And so there are various different ways of measuring each of these things that matter. And we've got millions of them, but obviously you want to assess your board skills and think about how that works. One of the things that is really interesting, and I labor a bit, really interested basically in continuous monitoring of the board sessions and getting feedback. I personally believe that the most effective boards should have, at every board meeting, 5 minutes at the end going, how did that go? Let's fill in a quick tracker and see how we're getting on, and what worked well and what could we do better next time. And I'm also a big believer in share of voice as the biggest driver of satisfaction in boards, hence my concerns about board proliferation of numbers. And the reason I believe that is because we have all the data that says that that is the case. The biggest driver of satisfaction is share of voice. And you can monitor that in quite interesting ways if you're having board meetings on Teams, but otherwise it's a pain in the backside to try and assess share of voice. But one of the things I thought was brilliant in terms of basics of effective engagement in the interactions is looking at the number of contributions people make and the share of voice that they have, and thinking about them in different ways. And I don't know if you can see my mouse circling over the page here. I think you might be able to.
Yeah.
But one of these areas is kind of really interesting, because this is how many times people have spoken up and then the length of how they've spoken up. And there's lots of variety. And the most effective contributors to board, in my view, from what I've seen, are the people who speak often and for short periods of time. And that dynamic in a board of relatively short contributions generally, and trying to but coming in on a range of issues can be really helpful to a board. So I don't know whether that's a style once people want to play out with, but what I think frustrates other members of boards is very long periods of uninterrupted talking by individuals. And so I think anything the chair can do to facilitate out of that dynamic, different techniques that can be used to drive different types of engagement. And when you have a big board, there's a lot of techniques that can be used to get input and opinion quickly. We're a big fan of Fist of Five. I've got a few police forces across the country using this. So in their kind of executive board meetings, so not in an oversight board context, but they will, the chair of the meeting will say, okay, we've got this issue coming through. The recommendation is this. How do people feel about that? Let's give it a Fist of Five. And people go, there's the code behind this, but you hold up your hand, five fingers or three fingers or one finger or whatever it is, and based on that, you see everyone's input straight away as to where they're landing on it and how much discussion is needed. If it's everyone's a five, like, okay, well, do we need to do a devil's advocate exercise here before we move on? That would be where you'd go with that. Or, but if everyone's at a one, you're like, well, clearly this is going to go back to the drawing board. Do we need to, what's the way through? And more likely, what you end up with is a meaningful conversation about strong opinions in either direction, someone who's in the middle. And then you can use that to curate the conversation. So as a chairs tool, things like this are really valuable because it also gets more voice and opinion. Some people hate doing it, and I think that's a really interesting thing to explore and then get into the psychology of that and think about why it doesn't work for the group. And that can be issues of power and representation in there as well, which are quite interesting. So I'm kind of like, if you're thinking about being systemic and adaptive, you need to have the psychological safety and space to be able to explore uncertainty. That needs a certain culture and tone on the board. It needs everyone to feel that they can speak up, and you need to therefore attend to these things and probably therefore track them in some way. Just to prove that I am the biggest governance geek in the world, we do a lot of heat maps around survey questions and responses to boards. But one of the things I find really interesting is how, when you look at a whole organization with multiple structures within it, or where you compare across the sector, a lot of the issues are recurring. So and this issue at the bottom, discussions are duplicating discussions in other boards, all of that kind of stuff come up again and again. So I think tracking some of these things is really interesting. But I think there's something about how do you, when you're on a board, kind of assess and reflect on how you're going, and you'll do your board effectiveness reviews and all those sorts of things. But I think that's going to be my main message, really. If you want to be systemic and adaptive and you want to evolve your approaches, I think there's something about having that space for yourselves to be systemic and adaptive and to ask yourself the questions and to create a structured slot within each board meeting where you reflect on the effectiveness. Perhaps everyone gets to fill in the quick survey or whatever, and you can tailor that however you want. And it doesn't need to involve hiring a professional services firm to do it. You can just do it yourself. But I think there's something in the power of being adaptive and saying, did our last board meeting like this, what are we going to do differently next time? That would, in a sense, almost reinforce the whole culture if you're wanting to move in this direction. So I will finish there. Um, this is me. Do follow on LinkedIn. I'm always really keen to connect to people who are interested in decision making and public sector impact in particular. And then follow our newsletter for occasional nerdery on governance if you would like to.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tom. That was really, really helpful and lots of nuggets that I'm taking away. You reminded me actually of a conversation I had a few weeks ago about kind of this shift to being more systemic is about reframing our kind of expertise as a sector, and especially for board members who are often appointed because of their expertise, see that as their real value to the organization, in kind of changing from the solution to being a trustee is kind of knowing the solution, to being a good trustee is about asking good questions and kind of supporting an organization through that. So yeah, fascinating. We're going to come to, there's been lots of questions that come in whilst you've been chatting, so we're going to come to some of those in due course. But first, I want to introduce Lisa, our second speaker. So Lisa Jordan is the Senior Managing Director of the DRK Foundation and trustee of 5 charities across Europe. Having been named as one of the top 10 influencers in civil society in the Netherlands, Lisa is committed to strengthening civil society in her work. The DRK Foundation sits on the board of all of the organisations that they fund, so they have a really unique perspective on how different approaches work in different organisations. So Lisa, if I could invite you to give us some examples from your experience of how more systemic and adaptive approaches to governance have or haven't helped organisations in your experience.
Thank you so much. And this has been so fascinating. And it's highly unusual to have so many geeks on the phone who follow board development as closely as the DRK Foundation does. The board can make a good charity a great charity. So the trustees, from our perspective, are the good to great catalyzers for any charity, for any social enterprise anywhere in the world. And there are different board cultures. So I just want to make people aware that the culture that the DRK Foundation follows is halfway between continental Europe and the United States. So probably very in line with what happens in the UK. I want to talk about two organizations. I thought I would give some examples. I'm not going to name them, but I will tell you the fields that they work in. The first one is working in the field of helping refugees overcome trauma. And the second one is working in the climate space. So very, very different types of topics that they're working on. But when DRK, the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, decides to support an organization, we always ask for a seat on the board, and we will not support the organization without a seat on a board, because we believe that that allows us to help the entrepreneurs and the founders that we are working with develop a scalable solution for the problem that they are trying to solve. So from that board position, we become an operating partner, providing support to, at this point, 247 organizations across the globe. And when we take the board seat, it's for 3 years. We only provide unrestricted capital, which is, as all of you know who are sitting on the boards of many, many charities, unrestricted capital is very difficult to find. And so DRK was trying to fill that hole in the market when the foundation was set up, which was about 20 years ago. So we are often the first board member because we work with earlier stage organizations. We are constantly building boards or rebuilding boards, going from a family and friends board to a board that is much more mature. And our goal is to build regenerative boards, very similar to the language that Tom and Naomi have already used. So when we're populating the board, we are populating the board with expertise that is specific to the needs of the organization. So that can be a communications person, that can be a lawyer, that can be an accountant, very specific types of expertise. We're looking at what's the networks that a board member actually brings to the table. Somebody asked a question about having young people on the board. We find that when we're working with a youth organization or an organization that is serving youth, having young people on the board allows for a much wider aperture of understanding of what's going on in young people's lives. So we don't bring young people onto the board to be the accountant or to be the financial person or the treasurer, however you want to put it. We bring them into the boards in order to understand both their viewpoint and what's happening in the lives of 13-year-olds or 22-year-olds, so on and so forth. And that role, that very specific role, is a network role, and it tends to equalize other types of knowledge that you might find when you've got 60-year-olds on your board and 15-year-olds on your boards. So networks, knowledge, expertise, these three are the most important three types of characteristics that we look for in a board member. And the last one, which I know many charities do, is to put people on their board who have provided the charity with a donation, like a high net worth individual or somebody from a foundation, as I am from a foundation. So, and we have some rules around what to do with that person who's on your board who comes with capital, because sometimes they like to throw their weight around. Sometimes they are very humble because they feel like they're not actually sure what they're doing there or why they're there, except as a gratitude for the support that they've offered to the organization. The two organizations that I want to talk about both have very, very strong boards. The refugee organization is led by a refugee. So that's a person with lived experience who is in the hot seat, who is in the CEO role. And that person is so effective at telling the story of what refugees actually have to endure before they in the journey of coming to their new home. that she attracted more capital and could grow the organization faster than her managerial skills allowed for. So it was really important to have a board that had strong managerial experience, a strong understanding of managerial processes, because they all needed to get much stronger in the organization, and could work with the senior team, not just with the CEO, but with the senior team, and helping to devise or design those kinds of processes and systems within the organization. And what that does is, when you have a project like that between a couple of board members and the senior team, it develops this incredible relationship of trust. And that relationship of trust allows for an opening up of tough questions on either side as organizations grapple with HR problems or other kinds of issues that are ongoing inside the organization. So one of the things that we like to aim for, the general rule here, is that we look for a board that can develop a culture, or we try to cultivate the culture of asking tough questions. So this is where the board chair has built trust and support with the entrepreneurs and the senior team. Other people on the board with specific expertise have their own relationships and own roles in guiding the CFO or the COO, or the communications person, working with somebody on the board who's got communication skills, where everybody gets to learn from each other. While expertise and knowledge and networks are super important, I think the driving force when we're building a board is to make sure that everybody is mission aligned. What's the mission alignment? And as the board member on the board, because they're motivated by the mission. The same organization has a split in the board, or has two types of board members with that overarching framework, still their networks, knowledge, expertise. Half of the board is people who come from a refugee background. Either their parents were refugees or migrants, or they themselves fled from Syria or Yemen, or another place in the world that is suffering right now, Ukraine, etc. So half of the people on the board actually have lived experience. And that has become so important in the refugee space, because there's a lot of victimization from organizations that are supporting refugees versus refugees receiving that support. There's an attitude of, we're helping you, as opposed to, how can we all be in this journey together? And the folks who have lived experience on the board really help those who have not, to understand how it feels to be a refugee when you are on the receiving end of services. And it was eye-opening, I can tell you, because I'm not a refugee. I am a migrant in the country within which I live, but it was quite eye-opening, and it really changed the tenor and the culture of the board to have half the board members have that kind of lived experience. The board has 7 people on it. The team is about 22, and I think that is a very nice mix. I'm cognizant of what Tom said about having a board that's too big. I absolutely agree with him. When you've got a lot of stakeholders to manage, you spend a lot of time managing them, and not always to the most effective potential that they might have. So for a board that's got a staff that's under 30, I think the 5 to 7 is a really good amount of people to have on the board, and you always have an odd number of folks on the board. The other story I want to tell, though, is about a climate organization that has an incredible generative entrepreneur who every day has 15 new ideas, and expects that the senior team will be able to drive against those brand new ideas every single day. And here's where a generative, adaptive board can be less helpful. When you have a founder who is a big thinker, super smart, totally understands the field that they're in, and can see many, many, many places and ways in which the field needs to be strengthened, and feels the responsibility for something as big as climate change on his or her shoulders, it is very important to make sure that the culture of the board is driving on mission, driving on the North Star. So where is this organization actually going and how are we going to get there? And can help to create a culture of greater discipline for the organization so that the organization's senior team and staff within the structure of the organization can actually develop strategies and processes and systems and products that are focused on goal. And can so if you have the point is that if you have a founder who's super generative, it might be better to have a board that is a little bit more disciplined in order to be able to drive disciplinary capacity through the entire organization. So both of these types of organizations exist out there, and understanding the culture that the leadership, the executive leadership within the organization has developed, and responding so that you can balance that culture as a board of trustees, I think is a super important thing for trustees to be working on. I have slides which I'm not going to read to you because that would take too long, but these are the 5 or 6 things that are important. Developing a culture of asking really tough questions, having a pick up the phone approach to solving problems and brainstorming ideas and seeking outside perspectives. So I talk to every one of the social entrepreneurs that I'm working with every other week formally, and the WhatsApps just fly back and forth more or less on a daily basis. The board should be fostering diverse perspectives, as I noted in the around the refugee example. We do get in the weeds. We're focused on the operations, the strategy, and not just process. That's especially true in for-profit boards. Somebody noted that it's really difficult to develop strategies together if you're competing for funds. In the world that we're living in right now, where there's great instability, I think we're going to see a shrinkage in the number of civic organizations out there. And if you've got your nose to the ground and you know who else is values aligned and is serving similar types of populations, I have 3 groups right now that are going through in our wider portfolio of 247 that are going through mergers. And being strategically aligned with the other organizations that are working on the same problem that you're working on, and knowing who has the same set of values before you start a merger, super important. So I think now we're going to see a lot of that. So now is a really good time to be looking at the field as a whole and understanding what its scope actually looks like. Boards are right size for the problem. So for the kind of groups that we're working at, 5 to 7 is a really good number. And Rob Kaplan, who's he's the Kaplan is in Draper Richards Kaplan. He's the co-chair of Goldman Sachs. He says all the time, it's really important that boards set up their own KPIs as a board. What is that KPI going to look like? Keep it very simple, have no more than 3 goals for the board itself in any given annual period, and evaluate it. And the last thing that I will say, that we have found it to be really important, that the board of trustees has 15 to 30 minutes in every meeting where they can have a private conversations amongst themselves, either to organize their thinking going into the board meeting, or to assess, as Tom said, when the board meeting closes, how did that go? So we always encourage folks to have executive sessions. How about if I leave it at there? Because I think we've covered more or less all of the other points with the other 2 speakers, and we can just go on back to Naomi.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisa. That was absolutely fascinating. The idea of the kind of board adopting the culture that counters the leadership culture really resonated with me, and kind of thinking about when an adaptive approach or when a systemic approach is appropriate. It's kind of thinking about what exists in your leadership team and how you can hold some of that headspace that might not be there at present. So yeah, lots to think about. My mind is whirring, and we've had some questions come in whilst you've both been talking, so I'm going to move over to those. So To start with, and I guess a question to both of you, and just quite a quick one before we dive into the audience questions. One from me, which is, what first step would you recommend to an organisation in either becoming more adaptive or more systemic? Just one thing.
I think,
yeah,
from my perspective, I think assessing what the culture of your current board is and having some understanding of the culture of the board, and then defining what are there's lots and lots of steps that you can take. But the first one is doing the survey. What kind of board are we now? So that you recognize what your baseline is and then understand where you might go towards.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. Tom?
I think this is an awful answer, but I think it'll depend on who you are, as to what the right first step is for you. So it might be that the right first step actually is to just really get clear on purpose and include within that a bit of being resilient and adaptive within part of your purpose, and understanding that might be the first thing that helps you to be clear, because that should be your anchor, and it's normally the problem that we come back to in board effectiveness. So that could be one way of taking action on the agenda, but I don't think the right answer would be the same for every organization who's already got that fully built and clear.
Of course. Lisa answered this in her talk, Tom, but lots of people wanted to know what you think the optimal size of a board is. How big is too big? What's the ideal size, etc.?
So I think there is a bit of an answer to this, which is that it depends on the cohesiveness and psychological safety of the group, to a significant degree. So if you have a group that is very aligned on the purpose of the organization, the right approaches to the organization, etc., then you could have a bigger board with a few diverging views within it, and it might be manageable. For me, I think if boards are getting bigger than kind of 10 people, you tend to hit some real complexity. And I personally am in favor of smaller boards or a mixture of a board and subcommittees that play out in a different way. So you can kind of keep the core group down to about, I think 7 is very hard to achieve, but that would be my magic number.
Fantastic. Great. Lisa, a couple of questions have come in for you about this idea of boards setting their own KPIs, and people asking if you might share a couple of examples of what that might look like. Any that come to mind?
Yeah, some of those KPIs may have to do with board development itself. When board members are rolling off and new board members are coming on, or in recognition that there's nobody on the board who really understands marketing and branding, for example, and this organization is about to roll out or scale up to serve, let's say, 20,000 kids, and should be capturing that knowledge. And how do we help them capture that knowledge? So we might look for a specialist on marketing and branding, or a specialist on data analysis, or so on and so forth. Another KPI that came about in the climate group that I was talking about earlier this year is that the kind of information that group puts out into the world at large is now being captured by ChatGPT and other generative AI things. And so last year, we started to look for expertise that could help the board understand what the impact of AI was going to look like on the services, not the products, but on the services offered by the particular organization. And we wanted to get ahead of that curve before it hit the organization. We knew it was coming. Now it's here, and we have a full strategy that we worked together with the team, with the senior team, and especially the hiring of specialists inside the senior team and a couple of consultants coming on. But that was a KPI for the board, was to figure out the impact of AI on products and services being offered by this particular climate group. So that's a second one.
Yeah, so it's more having these three kind of agreed goals for the work of the board, as opposed to necessarily the 3 key indicators of the work of the organisation.
That's right.
Yeah, that's really helpful. A question to both of you, kind of connected to that, about what's the right balance between the strategy side, the operation side, the kind of generative ideas side, for potentially, the example given in the question is a small charity of 25 staff, but generally, do you have a sense across organisations? Tom, I'll go to you first.
Yeah.
So do you want to clarify that one again?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I guess how can boards get the right balance between their different roles? So the kind of the fiduciary duties they have to meet the strategy duties that they have. How have you seen organisations get that balance right, and how have they supported that?
So I'm a big fan of purpose-driven boards, probably like Lisa. And so it becomes about, well, what are you trying to achieve and what are the ingredients to achieve that? And I would sort of theme that up, because some of the boring mechanics of standing agenda items, if you design them right, are really useful as long as you create those mechanisms Lisa and I both talked about in terms of open spaces and reflection. Like that should be the technique, and that's contextual. So and there should be a good agenda setting conversation, at the end of one meeting and flowing through into what the whoever is the owner of the agenda, which is a whole different question, but probably the executive more often than not. So yeah, I do think that having chunks of agenda around the key things that will drive your success, the achievement of your purpose, is probably the way to go, and that's why you always have, tracking of performance, you always have management of risk. There's a set of things you just have to do, but they can be really dynamic conversations if they're looked at in a purposeful way. The problem is when they become checkbox, not really talking about the things, like we're going to look at the risk register again. That's not very dynamic. The conversation should be, well, these are the things the exec are telling us are the top 10 risks that they're monitoring as an organization. Are these still the right risks that we are right? And now we want to think, why is this not on here? Like, let's have a real conversation about it. And if we were thinking about the ones that would be existential for us, what were the top 3? And we're really happy with the kind of mitigations we've put in place. Every conversation can be really dynamic, and the thing about the share of the meeting should be based around the purpose that you're trying to achieve and the right approach to managing that. So not a perfect answer for sure, but definitely about having some of your basics in place.
Yeah, and I think I've seen organisations do it really well, where they're just really clear on how some of those agenda items fall in terms of those different categories, so that they can at least see, well, actually, we've given 50% of our time to very process-based work, and even if we're just noting that to begin with, and then beginning to maybe change that, can be really helpful just to reflect. Lisa, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, one way to do it is to have a really clear dashboard at the board level. So I sat on this board that also works in the UK, does a lot of work on trying to get healthier food into the supermarket shelves. And I loved this board because the executive would report against a check, green, yellow, red dashboard, same dashboard every meeting. And then once a year, that dashboard would change. And then we would do a deep dive where there was a problem, or a deep dive, one, but only one each board meeting, a deep dive on a strategic question that was coming forth from the research that the organization produced. They produce a lot of research, which would drive the strategy, or would be input for the next round of strategic conversations. So it's actually balancing those two. You can actually do through process, where you have, these are the things we're going to report on all the time. Here's the red flag for this board meeting that's upcoming. This is the conversation that the executive team would really like to have with the board, or the board comes in and says, this is the conversation we'd really like to have with the executive team. But one, because otherwise your board meeting goes off into the ether somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful. Thank you, Lisa. There's a couple of questions that have been waiting very patiently about kind of how organisations can centre lived experience in your governance. As I mentioned, we have a whole webinar on that topic that we'll share afterwards, but I just wanted to briefly invite both of you to share any reflections you might have I suppose from MPC's perspective, we do quite a lot of work in involvement in decision making, and it speaks to this point on purpose and thinking about how, why you want lived experience embedded within your board, and then coming to what's the best structure for that. Is it having one or two trustees who have that lived experience, or as Lisa talks about, having half the board or all of the board, and then how might you support that? Or is it having a parallel advisory board? Or there's lots of different structures, but thinking really intentionally about the purpose of that before you get bogged down in the structures, I suppose. But anyway, I'll hand over potentially to you first, Lisa, and then to Tom on that.
I'll just say that there was a pushback on this idea of having expertise on the board, and this answer goes hand in hand. I just want to address the pushback also on having people who have finance backgrounds or legal backgrounds or so on and so forth. Actually, when you are purposeful about, we are bringing this person on the board because they know a lot about X, or we're bringing this person on the board because they have a network that is super necessary for the growth of this organization, or we're bringing this person on the board because they've spent 20 years working on early childhood education and know the field. That's knowledge. That's not expertise, but that's knowledge, right? So these are like three ways that we think about bringing folks on board. In the column of expertise, there are tons and tons and tons of people with refugee backgrounds in every single Western state in Europe right now who are accountants, who are lawyers, who are doctors, who are highly educated in the countries from which they come, are dying to figure out ways in which to be able to use that expertise instead of driving a taxi somewhere, et cetera. And so when we were building the board with the refugee organization, we purposefully looked for people with lived experience and financial backgrounds or accounting backgrounds. We purposefully looked for people with lived experience and a legal background. This dovetailing of professional expertise and lived experience has made a huge difference, both in the authority and the culture that everyone has sitting around the board as a set of equals. So for me, it feels really important that one, as a board member, you know why you specifically are on that board. You're on that board because you have this kind of expertise, or because you have a network, or because you have knowledge, or so on and so forth. And it also fulfills a role that's absolutely necessary for the organization, for the fiduciary and legal and governance roles that trustees play all the time. So that's one way to do it, is to pair the kind of thing that you need for the board and then pair it with somebody with lived experience.
Tom, any thoughts on that?
I thought the question was really good because it was saying, how do you include people with lived experience? And I think that is the question, because I've seen plenty of people who've been hired, onto boards for their lived experience and then aren't included at all. So I think that's probably my only thing to say, and is that needs to be thought about if you are going to do that. That's the first thing. It's like, and it may require more behavior change on the part of other trustees in order to get the best out of someone with lived experience of different things. And it can be really educational for the board to understand, lived experience of trauma, triggers, and all these different things, and to agree in a sensitive way how to therefore conduct meetings, how to run things through, all that kind of stuff. So it's very potentially important. And so I almost feel like the boards that leads me to sort of think boards need to do work sometimes before they make these sorts of steps, if they aren't already very sort of, well educated around kind of different types of trauma, different types of inclusion that might need to come into play depending on what kind of lived experience you're going for. So I think that's probably where I'd go with it. It's actually, there's a bit of a board development thing to be able to benefit, because it's transformational when you get it right. But can go wrong because you end up
absolutely. And
marginalized.
I've certainly had conversations with charities who sort of tried it without doing that background work and the changes to processes and culture that is necessary, and therefore it's not worked. And then they go, well, it just doesn't work for us. And actually acknowledging your own responsibility and, in, as you say, facilitating that inclusive environment and changing processes and culture as may be needed. a specific question for each of you, if that's okay. So, Lisa, for you, does the DRK Foundation recruit employees with a specific purpose for them to sit on boards? A kind of question about model. And Tom, a question about is there any evidence about the link between board satisfaction and board effectiveness? To Lisa first.
If I understand the question correctly, the question is, does DRK recruit people like me because of our capacity to be able to sit on boards? Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And I suppose how much of your time is therefore spent in your board roles as part of your professional role?
Yeah. The DRK recruits people who have built their own organizations because we're working with social entrepreneurs. So almost everybody has a technical expertise of some sort or another. Mine is in monitoring and evaluation, but has also built a social organization of one sort or another, either a health organization, education, human rights, you name it. So our senior team of managing directors all have this kind of, we've all been through the failures and the pain of trying to set up your own social organization, all of us. Some with greater degrees of success than others, but that's exactly what happened. So we all have executive experience of working with boards as the chief executive officer or the executive director. We are all trained when we come into DRK what it means to be a DRK board member, because we do not take a second or third term in the boards. It's a one-time term in the board. Oftentimes, it's organizations that have very nascent boards. And so it's our job to go from whatever that board culture is to the generative culture that we are trying to create, to a generative board. And there is a training process that every single one of us goes through to understand exactly what that means, and exactly the kinds of cultures that, and there is also a playbook for the entrepreneurs, so that everybody knows when they come into the portfolio, this is the kind of board we hope to leave you with. And it's time bound. There's a real sense of urgency. And I would say that in my position, I probably spend 70% of my time, which I am paid for. So that's different from many people who are on this call. I spend 70% of my time building out these boards and making sure that the boards are functional in the right kind of way. But on top of that, I also sit on 3 other boards as a volunteer. I've been sitting on boards for a really long time. I'm a lot older than I look.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. Tom, the question on board effectiveness and board satisfaction.
So there is actually quite a strong relationship. I was thinking about it because, to be honest, board effectiveness is quite elusive to measure in a really hard, certain way. But in terms of the measures of impact that you can get to with various different techniques in terms of transmission of board into decisions, quality of decisions, and then action, awareness of changes made in the organization, all these different things. It's actually pretty high. And it's because satisfaction again is driven by the sort of dynamism of the conversation. Most people who are on boards kind of know whether they're good or not. It's one of the weird things about the board effectiveness review is you go through these layers of understanding as you go through a board review. So pretty quickly, you know whether this is generally a good board or generally screwed. And you kind of get to that answer within about, a day and a half. It's then about uncovering the why and the what are they good at, where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses, and what is the capacity to change and what can unlock change for them, that it gets it requires a lot more time. So I think the correlation is reasonably high, but I was actually trying to get some data out and see if I could do something while it was on here, but I think it's probably a question for a PhD at some point.
So Naomi, can I take another bite at that apple? In 2022, we brought all of the board chairs and all of the CEOs together in our portfolio. So this is I think we had about 76 active portfolio organizations. So 76 from all around the world: India, UK, Germany, Netherlands, US, et cetera. And we did a survey, separate surveys of all the board chairs and all the CEOs. And to a T, every single board chair rated themselves better than the CEOs rated them. So to a T. And it is a very tricky relationship to develop, because the executive team often wants the board out of the way. The board often falls short of the expectations on the generative side that that is actually the good part for the executive director or for the CEO. But it's quite interesting when you bring them together and start to talk about, what's a really good board actually look like. Apropos to what Tom said, the survey results were that the board chairs thought they were doing an absolutely fine job, and the executives had a very different opinion.
You also get the same the other way around, of course, don't you? That's basically the fundamental attribution bias. We all think we're great and everyone is useless. And also, like, when this is actually, everyone knows the research on this, or some people will know the research on this. If you ask someone about a mistake or failing or something that's gone wrong, if they're talking about their mistake, failing, or what's gone on, they very much see and just talk about and describe the circumstantial drivers and factors that led to that.
Yeah.
When they look at someone else where something's gone wrong or there's a mistake or something's happened, they basically say that person's an idiot. So there's something about the nature of human psychology and our ability to understand context. I do think that's a really important part of being an effective trustee, that kind of situational understanding, empathy, etc., because you can get into an adversarial dynamic on a board pretty easily and pretty quickly, and that is part of it. Like, you have to accept that sometimes these relationships are going to be really tense and they're going to be difficult, and there's going to be, conflict, and sometimes that's good, because sometimes ultimately that leads to a change in the exec or some of these things that need to happen. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but sensitivity to and understanding of the context in which everyone on the board is operating is probably a key part of success.
And it comes back, Tom, to what you're saying about humility as well, and kind of recognizing our own shortcomings as board members too. And I'm just going to ask one last question to you both, and then we're going to move on to the short kind of reflection session for those on the call. So I'm going to group two of the questions that have come through. So one of them is, how do you encourage trustees to be as self-reflective as they need to be? And then the other is, do these changes have to be chair-led, or can it be initiated by a trustee? So I'm going to group them into a question, which is essentially, as a trustee and not a chair, what can an individual do to take this work forward?
Who do you want first?
I think you just volunteered yourself, Tom, by asking that.
Well, I quite like. I mean, I think a trustee can clearly initiate this. The question is, can they succeed without the support of the chair? And the answer to that is probably not.
Right.
Right.
The answer is no.
No. But you can initiate, but and that's actually, and then that gets into, like, how to be a good trustee depends on the nature of your chair. Some chairs are always asking, like, what can we do differently? How does it work? And it's brilliant. And you can't raise his hand and, oh, it's brilliant. Let's try this thing out. Let's be experimental. And others will be like, it wasn't my idea, so I think we really need to stick to the way we've already done things already, etc. So there, you'll just have to use your powers of persuasion. That's a whole different webinar, but I'd suggest making it their idea would probably be a good start.
Fantastic. Lisa?
Yes, I really agree. It's you can't move forward unless the board itself wants something to happen. And I'm not the board chair. I try and steer away from sitting on the board chair because I know I have a limited engagement in these boards. And so it's empowering the board chair to make a decision that's going to work both for the board and for the organization, and to make the job more fun, to be totally honest. I mean, nobody wants to just sit there and rubber stamp. You want to actually engage in the mission of the organization. So, and I like to tie all these tools to mission. And if you are the board chair, do a survey every year. Do a survey every year.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much both for responding to those questions. I'm really sorry if we've not got to your question. I've tried to kind of cover as many as we can across a range of topics. It is worth saying that there are recordings of lots of many years of these webinars, and we've touched on quite a lot of the topics that people have asked about over the years. So I'll make sure there's a link to that, and you can delve into the archives if there's something particular you're interested in. So that's particularly been prompted by the question on AI, because the last one of these we did was on AI for trustees. I now wanted to move into the kind of reflection session section of this session as we draw to a close. And this is really me taking kind of chairs and hosts prerogative. And it's inviting each of you who are on the call today to rank your performance against some of these ideas that we've been talking about today, to suggest anything that you think trustees could do to become more adaptive and systemic, and to commit to one action that you're going to take forwards. Leaving today's conversation. So I've just popped a link in the chat to a Mentimeter poll. There are 6 sliding scales. You can move through it at your own pace to kind of reflect on where your organisation is, where your board is, and then 2 open text questions for you to feed into. So I'll give everyone a chance to kind of reflect on that in the background. Whilst you do, I just wanted to, I suppose, ask one final question that's on my mind, and it comes from your introduction, Tom, about having the kind of blank space on the agenda. I really love that idea, and I wondered if you or Lisa had any views about how you, I suppose, and it links to this one strategic question idea as well, how you avoid that being space that people then just see as almost like any other business can be, of, oh great, that means we can wrap up early, and actually defending the space for and the time for those questions rather than compressing them. I don't know if you have any thoughts, and that is purely me just being curious.
It just doesn't go at the end. Just don't put it at the end. It's
yeah,
blindingly obvious, and I've never had that problem. Quite the opposite. It can take a while to get going sometimes, but actually once it gets going, there's value in it. It's difficult when the board has limited time and the agenda is really packed. But that's partly about the other discipline that the boards need, which is to have a purpose-led, actively managed agenda rather than a "has anyone got any topics for the board this week" thing going around, which is generative but not good generative in my experience.
And when those conversations are slow to get going, have you seen particular prompts or questions that have helped people to kind of start that conversation?
I can't think offhand. I think
no, don't worry.
Yeah.
Put you on the spot.
There would be a number. Yeah.
Lisa, do you have any the kind of one strategic question model you mentioned? Are there any that prompted particularly interesting conversations?
Well, the one about how our entire business model is going to be replaced by AI next year. What do we do? Super interesting conversation. And in fact, the results were also super interesting, because it turns out that people don't know how to query AI. Especially in highly technical climate issues. And so the organization has set up trainings for lawyers to figure out how to query the kinds of information that would be most useful to them on climate. So the solutions were also really interesting. And it also turned out that the AI was going to push the knowledge of the organization further out into the world and into the hands of people who actually needed it, which was a goal. So it was both a threat and an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, both. I'm just going to briefly share my screen and have a look at some of the input we've been having come through on the Menti. Bear with me whilst I juggle screens. So this is the first slide around kind of how people are feeling against the 3 suggestions to be more adaptive. And it's interesting, these feel quite positive, and bearing in mind that at the start of this, most people felt not very confident in the concept of it. It's great to hear that that's already actually maybe more a part of your practice than you might have felt. And with the idea of kind of being more uncomfortable with uncertainty potentially being the biggest area for development across those of us who are here today. On the systemic side of things, these are, I suppose, much lower scores than adaptive. So maybe this feels like a more of an area for development in general for those of you on the call. And I don't think it's a surprise, to me at least, that the idea of setting priorities with peers and partners is the sort of lowest scoring of the 3, because that is really, I mean, we see pockets of that happening across the sector, but I think it is a really new way of thinking. Just to call back to what Lisa was saying about kind of finding the strategically aligned organisations, the value aligned organisations ahead of any potential conversations about merger in the example that she gave. Just to say that is something we're going to be delving more into in our July webinar on achieving impact in a challenging financial context. So if you're interested in that specifically, then do sign up for that one. lots of ideas about how this can happen, building on what we've heard about today. So I'm really looking forward to thinking about these. But I think the idea of having that kind of more open agenda, changing how you use the agenda time, and changing the overall kind of culture of that board to be learning focused, to be collaborative, to have more of a coaching approach coming through from there. And then lastly, looking at kind of what's next. Lots of people just saying, digest this, think about this, apply this to the work of their organisation. So I'm glad that there's lots for people to think about, and I hope you can take this forward and put some of this into practice in your work. So without further ado, I'll begin to draw us to a close. So just a few final things to say, which is enormous thanks to Tom and Lisa for being our panelists today. I've learned so much from both of you. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I hope that everyone is taking away some interesting insights. Again, huge thank you to the Clothworkers Company for funding this series of webinars and supporting the work on governance that we do at MPC. If there are topics you'd like to have future seminars about, please do put them in the chat, drop us an email, make them known to us. We're getting towards the time of year where we start thinking about the topics for the next year. So this is your time to feed those in. A reminder that when you close this call, a feedback survey will pop up in a new tab for you to respond to, and that is so valuable for us in showing the value of this work back to the cloth workers, but also in learning and improving a series of events. And lastly, the next event is on the 4th of June from 1 till 2 p.m. and that is on trusteeship and influencing in the new political landscape. We've got a great panel already lined up, and we're really looking forward to that conversation. So thank you so much. Do join us for another conversation, and have a lovely afternoon. Bye all.